In the rural religious history of slaveholding Mississippi, there exists a dark and singular crime, an episode so horrific that for more than half a century it was erased from all official records, surviving only as a terrified whisper. The story concerns the disappearance of 3 small children from the home of a respected Methodist pastor in Claiborne County, a case that went cold in the winter of 1851. But the true macabre mystery began 53 years later, in 1904, when the bones of those children were finally found buried beneath an old dog kennel. A forensic report determined that they had been deliberately fed to the pastor's own attack dogs, yet showed no signs of a struggle. They had been lured to their deaths by someone they trusted implicitly. This is the story of the slave who fed her pastor's children to the dogs, a terrifying tale of justice and retribution that defies simple explanation. It is the case of Anna, an enslaved woman who endured systematic torture under the guise of religion, and who orchestrated an act of vengeance so precise and so absolute that it destroyed not just a family, but the very moral authority of the church that enabled her suffering. We will piece together a hidden truth from a mosaic of buried evidence, a secret diary, a doctor's ledger, and a community's guilty silence, to understand how a woman with nothing left to lose chose to become an instrument of a justice more primal and more terrifying than any law written by man. We are dedicated to unearthing the most profound and challenging stories from the forgotten corners of history. To support our work and join a community committed to historical truth, please subscribe to Before the Story and ensure your notifications are enabled. If you value these deep investigations, take a moment to like this video. It helps our research reach others who are searching for the same truths. Now, let us know in the comments from what part of the world you are joining us to uncover this story tonight. Together we will venture back to a time and place where faith and horror became one. The narrative begins not in the year of the crime, but decades later, with the dispassionate voice of science. A forensic summary, filed in Claiborne County in August 1904, documents the discovery of skeletal remains at the site of the long-abandoned Pritchard Parish. It notes the subjects were juveniles, their bones bearing the unmistakable marks of a canine attack. Crucially, the report states the methodical burial and location, deep beneath the foundation of a collapsed dog kennel, point to a deliberate concealment of the bodies. This cold, clinical document serves as the endpoint of a great and terrible mystery, an irrefutable conclusion whose origins had been systematically erased from the official history of this deeply religious Mississippi community. To understand the events that led to this grim discovery, we must turn to an artifact unearthed 15 years prior, in 1889. During renovations of the old Methodist church, workers found a small, leather-bound diary concealed within a hollowed-out section of the pulpit. Its pages, filled with a precise, trembling script, were identified as the private record of Sarah Pritchard, the pastor's wife, who had left the county with her surviving children in 1851 and died years later in obscurity. The diary was not a record of daily life, but a frantic, fragmented confession, a testament to a horror she had witnessed and been powerless to stop, a story that began long before the children disappeared. Her first relevant entry, dated October 1850, sets the stage for the coming tragedy. It speaks of a young enslaved woman named Anna, who was kept not in the main house, but in a locked, windowless cabin behind the church itself, a place of supposed spiritual reflection. Sarah writes of her husband, the Reverend Samuel Pritchard, a man whose public sermons on family and Christian submission were a source of comfort to his congregation. Yet her words betray a deep unease, a fissure in the foundation of her faith, as she describes the Reverend's private justifications for Anna's isolation and the strange, disquieting sounds that emanated from that cabin after dark. The world of Claiborne County in 1851 was a closed system, a society built upon the twin pillars of cotton and the Word of God. The Reverend Pritchard was more than a spiritual leader. He was the primary architect of the community's moral order, a man whose judgment on matters earthly and divine was considered absolute. His family, a wife, 5 children, and the enslaved persons who served them, was seen as a model of Christian piety. This public image, so carefully constructed and fiercely defended, would become a critical element in the unfolding drama, serving as both a shield for the Reverend's private actions and a justification for the silence of those who suspected the truth. In her diary, Sarah describes Anna not with the dismissive tone of a mistress, but with a kind of fearful pity. She notes Anna's youth, her quiet resilience, and an unnerving stillness in her gaze, as if she were observing their world from a great and sorrowful distance. Anna's duties were not confined to domestic service. She was, as Sarah would come to understand, a living instrument in the Reverend's a theology of pain. He claimed his methods were designed to break her sinful pride, but Sarah's writing hints at a dawning awareness that the true purpose of Anna's suffering was far more sinister, a ritual intended not for the salvation of Anna's soul, but for the corruption of his own sons. The geography of the Pritchard property itself was symbolic of the family's fractured morality. The main house, with its manicured gardens and open verandas, represented the public face of piety and order. Behind it stood the church, the seat of the Reverend's authority, and further back still, hidden by a copse of cypress trees, lay the locked cabin and the dog kennels. This was the domain of the pastor's hidden life, a place where his sermons on discipline were put into brutal practice, and where the dogs, trained not for hunting, but for guarding and attacking, served as a constant, low-growling threat, the final enforcers of their master's will. The initial entries in Sarah's diary are marked by a desperate attempt to reconcile her husband's actions with her faith. She quotes scripture, reminds herself of a wife's duty to submit, and prays for understanding. But a thread of doubt runs through every line. She writes of sleepless nights, of the sound of the cabin door bolt sliding home, of the way her own children would fall silent whenever their father approached. It is the record of a conscience slowly awakening to an unbearable truth, the quiet prelude to a storm that would not just shatter her family, but challenge the very notion of divine justice in a land built on bondage. The diary, therefore, is not merely a record of events. It is the testimony of a soul in crisis. It documents the slow poisoning of a household, the perversion of faith into a tool of absolute power, and the silent suffering of a woman whose humanity was denied by everyone except the one person who was too afraid to speak for her. The story of what happened to the Pritchard children does not begin with their disappearance. It begins here, in these hushed, terrified entries, with the first documented moments of a cruelty that would eventually demand an equally cruel resolution. The stage is set with these 2 primary documents: the forensic report, which tells us what happened, and the diary, which will begin to tell us why. The bones under the kennel are the final, horrifying punctuation mark to a story Sarah Pritchard could only bring herself to write in secret. As we delve deeper into her account, we are not just solving a historical crime, we are bearing witness to the collapse of a world where the lines between salvation and damnation, between the sacred and the profane, were not merely blurred, but erased entirely by the hand of a single righteous man. The first true anomaly documented in Sarah Pritchard's diary appears in an entry from November 1850, a night she describes as unnaturally cold and still. It marks the moment when her abstract fears about her husband's methods coalesced into a specific, observable horror. She records seeing the Reverend lead their two eldest sons, Josiah, aged 14, and Abel, aged 12, not to the church for evening prayers, but toward the dark shape of Anna's cabin. He carried with him a ceremonial whip, an instrument not used for plantation discipline, but one reserved for congregational rituals of penance, its leather tassels meant to purify, not merely punish. Sarah recounts watching from the second-story window of her bedroom, her view partially obscured by the skeletal branches of a winter oak. She describes the scene with a chilling detachment, as if narrating a tableau she cannot fully comprehend. The Reverend did not unlock the cabin door himself. Instead, he handed the key to his eldest son, Josiah, forcing the boy to perform the act of opening the prison. She notes that Josiah's hand trembled so violently that it took him 3 attempts to fit the key into the lock, a small detail that speaks volumes about the boy's state of mind, a silent rebellion against a duty he was being forced to accept. Inside the cabin, she could see nothing, but she could hear. The sounds were not the sharp cries of ordinary punishment, but something more rhythmic and sustained, punctuated by her husband's low, liturgical voice, as if he were reciting scripture or leading a prayer. This fusion of religious language with the methodical infliction of pain is the core of the anomaly. It was not a beating born of anger, but a cold, calculated ritual. Sarah writes that the sounds seemed to go on for an eternity, a measured cadence of suffering that was more terrifying than any outburst of rage could ever be. Her diary then focuses on the return of her sons. She describes them emerging from the cabin, their faces ashen in the moonlight, their eyes wide with a look of stunned shock that she had never seen before. They did not speak to their father, nor he to them. They walked back to the house in a rigid, unnatural silence, like automatons who had just performed a task that had hollowed them out from the inside. Sarah notes that Abel was visibly ill, stumbling on the path, while Josiah stared straight ahead, his expression a mask of stony compliance that was, in its own way, even more disturbing than his brother's sickness. The Reverend's justification for this ritual is recorded later that night. When Sarah found the courage to question him, he did not offer an explanation based on discipline or control. Instead, he framed it as a theological necessity. He told her, and she dutifully wrote it down, that to become true men of God in a fallen world, his sons needed to understand that pain was a tool of salvation. He claimed that by forcing them to administer punishment to Anna, he was teaching them to wield divine authority, to purge sin without succumbing to worldly emotion. He was, in his own mind, forging prophets. This explanation is the documented moment where Sarah's world begins to fracture. She attempts to accept it, writing, "It is the Lord's difficult work, and I am not to question his wisdom as it flows through my husband." But her own words betray her. The description of her sons' traumatized faces, the unnatural silence that followed, and the rhythmic liturgical nature of the sounds from the cabin all contradict the idea of a righteous lesson. It was an initiation, a forced entry into a secret world of cruelty that had been sanctified by the language of the divine. The anomaly is not just the act of abuse itself, but its transformation into a sacred duty. The Reverend was not simply a cruel master. He was a high priest presiding over a dark sacrament, with his own sons as acolytes and Anna as the living sacrifice. This perversion of faith is what sets the Pritchard case apart. It removes the crime from the realm of ordinary brutality and places it in a far more unsettling category, a systematic, spiritual corruption that used the very tools of salvation to achieve a state of damnation. In the days that followed, Sarah observed a marked change in her sons. Abel became withdrawn and prone to nightmares, while Josiah adopted a rigid, cold demeanor, mimicking his father's authoritative tone with his younger siblings. The lesson, it seemed, had been learned, but what it had taught was not piety, but fear and the performance of power. The family dynamic had been irrevocably altered. A secret now existed between the father and his sons, a shared trauma that excluded and isolated the women of the household. This first documented ritual is the key that unlocks the entire mystery. It establishes the pattern of abuse not as a means to an end, the control of a slave, but as an end in itself. The purpose was to implicate the next generation, to make them participants in the cruelty, thereby ensuring its continuation and their silence. Anna's pain was secondary. The primary goal was the indoctrination of the boys. And in that cold, still November night, as Sarah Pritchard watched from her window, she was unknowingly witnessing the planting of a seed that would eventually bear the most terrible fruit imaginable. As the winter of 1850 bled into the new year, Sarah Pritchard's diary became a catalogue of escalating dread. The ritualistic sessions in the cabin behind the church were no longer isolated events. They became a routine, a grim fixture in the family's weekly life, as predictable as Sunday service. Sarah's entries grow shorter, more fragmented, as if the act of writing down the details had become too painful to bear. She ceases to record her husband's justifications, instead focusing on the physical and emotional toll the abuse was taking, not just on Anna, but on everyone within its orbit. She notes Anna's growing physical deterioration with a clinical, almost detached eye, a persistent limp that Anna tried to conceal, a split lip that the Reverend dismissed as a sign of her insolent tongue, a way she would flinch if anyone moved too suddenly in her presence. These observations, recorded in Sarah's tight, controlled script, paint a portrait of a person being systematically broken down. Yet Sarah also notes a change in Anna's eyes. The fear, she writes, was still there, but it was being overlaid by something else, a hard, unreadable calmness, a profound stillness that seemed to absorb the violence without breaking. This subjective account finds its objective counterpart in a document that would not see the light of day until 1958, discovered in a collection of papers from a descendant of the town's former physician. The private medical ledger of Dr. Alastair Finch contains a series of entries from early 1851 that corroborate and amplify Sarah's fears. In one entry, dated January of that year, Dr. Finch describes being summoned to the Pritchard property to treat what the Reverend called a minor domestic accident. The patient was Anna, and the injury was a poorly healed fracture of the ulna, the bone in her forearm. Dr. Finch's notes are spare, but his professional suspicion is palpable between the lines. He records the Reverend's explanation that Anna had fallen while carrying firewood, but then adds a private observation. The nature of the fracture suggests a torsional force, as if the arm were violently twisted, not entirely consistent with a simple fall. This small, expert dissent, hidden in a private ledger, is the first piece of external evidence that contradicts the official narrative being constructed by the pastor. A hint that the violence was more intimate and deliberate than a mere accident could explain. A second entry from Dr. Finch, dated just 6 weeks later, is even more damning. He was called again, this time to treat a fever. While examining Anna, he discovered a series of peculiar marks on her back, which he describes with medical precision. Several circular burns, uniform in size and spacing, consistent with the application of a heated metal rod. The pastor claims these are the marks of her own carelessness with the hearth fire, yet they appear methodical, almost patterned. Ulu. The doctor's use of the word patterned transforms the injuries from a random collection of wounds into evidence of a deliberate, repeated act of torture. The accumulation of this evidence, drawn from two completely independent sources, the diary of a terrified wife and the ledger of a suspicious doctor, creates an undeniable portrait of systematic, ritualistic abuse. Sarah provides the emotional and spiritual context, the perversion of faith into a tool of cruelty. Doctor. Finch provides the cold, scientific proof, the language of fractures and burns that gives a name to the horror she could only describe in hushed, fearful tones. Together, they form a powerful, cross-verified account of the secret life of the Pritchard parish. Sarah, for her part, seems to sense the methodical nature of the cruelty without understanding its full implication. In one entry, she describes Anna's hands, noting that her fingers were often bruised and swollen. She puzzles over this, as Anna's domestic duties were not arduous enough to cause such injuries. The audience, armed with Dr. Finch's observations, can infer a truth that Sarah could not, that Anna was likely forced to hold on to something or was held down during the application of the heated rod, her hands being crushed in the process. The evidence accumulates, filling in the horrific gaps in Sarah's own understanding. The parallel accounts also reveal the extent of the Reverend's control over the narrative. He was able to summon a doctor, present him with a victim of obvious torture, and confidently provide patently false explanations. This demonstrates a belief in his own impunity, a conviction that his moral authority in the community was so absolute that it could override even the evidence of a man's own eyes. Doctor. Finch's private doubts, confined to his ledger, show that while the Reverend's authority was not entirely successful in convincing him, it was powerful enough to ensure his public silence. This careful layering of subjective and objective evidence builds a case that is both emotionally devastating and logically irrefutable. We are no longer just in the realm of a wife's fears. We are in the realm of documented fact. The anomalous rituals are not just a spiritual crisis for Sarah, they are a series of verifiable physical assaults. The accumulation of these details serves to strip away any ambiguity, leaving the audience with the stark reality of Anna's situation and setting the stage for the inevitable, catastrophic reaction that such relentless pressure must eventually provoke. Bina. The turning point for Sarah Pritchard, the moment her passive horror transforms into an active, articulated fear, is not prompted by a new act of violence against Anna, but by a subtle, chilling observation of her own children. In a long, panicked entry from late winter 1851, she describes an incident that crystallizes the true purpose of her husband's dark theology. It is here, in her own words, that the first coherent hypothesis about the nature of the evil in her house is formed, a theory that shifts the focus from the suffering of a slave to the damnation of her own family. She recounts coming upon her 3 youngest children, Gideon, aged 6, and his 2 older sisters, Ruth and Mary, playing in the garden near the church. They were not engaged in a game of fantasy or innocence, but in a grim pantomime of what they had unknowingly absorbed from the atmosphere of their home. They had tied a small doll to a branch with a piece of twine and were taking turns striking it with a switch. their faces set with a strange, serious concentration. This mimicry of punishment on its own would have been unsettling enough for any mother. But it was the language they used that struck Sarah with the force of a physical blow. She overheard her young son, Gideon, explaining the rules of their game to his sisters. He told them, in a perfect high-pitched imitation of his father's sermonic cadence, that the doll was full of sin and that they had to hurt the badness out of it to make it good again. He used the exact phrases, purification, stubborn will, necessary pain, that she had heard the Reverend use when justifying his actions in the cabin. The poison had seeped through the walls. The ritual had become a child's game. In that moment, Sarah's diary reveals her epiphany. The methodical abuse of Anna was not just an isolated act of cruelty directed at one person. It was a lesson, a living sermon being preached to the entire household, and her youngest, most impressionable children had become its most fervent disciples. They were learning not from the Bible, but from the muffled sounds from the cabin and the cold, righteous anger of their father, that cruelty, when dressed in the robes of piety, was not only acceptable, but virtuous. Her husband was not merely punishing a slave, he was actively cultivating a legacy of violence. Her hypothesis, articulated in a frantic, sprawling script that fills 2 full pages of the diary, is a devastating indictment of her husband's spiritual project. She writes, "He is not teaching them piety. He is teaching them his cruelty. This is not a house of faith, but a classroom for monsters, and he is the schoolmaster. He is not forging them in God's image, but in his own." This is a profound break from her previous attempts to rationalize his behavior. She no longer sees it as a misguided attempt at salvation, but as a deliberate act of corruption. This realization reframes the entire narrative. The central tragedy is no longer solely Anna's suffering, but the spiritual destruction of the Pritchard children. They are not just witnesses to the horror, they are becoming its next generation of perpetrators. The Reverend's project is revealed to be one of monstrous self-replication, an effort to ensure that his particular brand of righteous sadism would outlive him. The stakes have now been raised exponentially. It is not just one woman's life that is in danger, but the souls of an entire family. Sarah's new understanding also casts Anna's role in a different light. If the children are the students, Anna is the unwilling textbook, the living flesh upon which the lessons are inscribed. Her pain is the medium through which the Reverend's ideology is transmitted to his heirs. This makes the crime against her even more profound. She is being used not just for labor or control, but as a tool for the moral disfigurement of innocent children, a fact that would no doubt have been horrifyingly clear to Anna herself. The diary entry concludes with a note of utter despair and helplessness. Sarah recognizes the full scope of the evil, but she sees no way to combat it. Her husband's authority is absolute, sanctified by his position and his congregation. To challenge him would be to challenge the entire moral structure of her world. She is trapped, a silent witness to the damnation of her own offspring. Her new, terrible knowledge, a burden she must carry alone. This first hypothesis, born from the chilling mimicry of children, is the intellectual and emotional climax of the story's rising action. It provides the why behind the horror, and it sets the stage for the coming retribution. For if the true crime was the corruption of the children, then the eventual justice would, with a terrible and poetic symmetry, be directed at them as well. Sarah, in her diary, has unknowingly articulated the very logic that would soon lead to their destruction. Armed with her horrifying new understanding, Sarah Pritchard made one desperate attempt to appeal to a power outside of her husband's immediate control. Her diary documents a decision to speak with the deacons of the church, the small council of men who served as the reverend's advisors and the community's moral guardians. It was a significant risk, a direct challenge to the patriarchal order that demanded a wife's silent submission. Her hope was that these men of God, when presented with her concerns, would recognize the spiritual danger and intervene. The outcome of this appeal and its official record reveals the deep social fracture that made the tragedy inevitable. The official minutes from the Claiborne County Methodist Deacons meeting, dated February 1851, were preserved in the church archives and rediscovered by local historians in the 1960s. The document is a model of bureaucratic detachment, its dry, formal language belying the dramatic confrontation it records. It notes that Sister Sarah Pritchard requested a private audience to discuss a matter of domestic and spiritual concern. It records that she spoke for nearly an hour. Her voice, according to the scribe's parenthetical note, strained with emotion. The substance of her appeal, as summarized in the minutes, was a carefully worded expression of concern about the severity and nature of the discipline being applied to the enslaved girl, Anna. She did not directly accuse her husband of cruelty, a charge that would have been unthinkable. Instead, she framed her argument in theological terms, suggesting that the methods being used might be hardening the hearts of her sons rather than purifying them, and that the spirit of the discipline was beginning to feel more punitive than redemptive. It was the most forceful challenge she could mount without openly declaring her husband a monster. The deacon's response, as recorded in the same document, was swift, unified, and utterly dismissive. They deliberated for less than 10 minutes before rendering their verdict. The minutes state that the council, after prayerful consideration, concluded that Sister Pritchard's concerns were born from a bout of female anxiety unbecoming of a pastor's wife. They characterized her plea as an emotional overreaction, a failure to understand the difficult but necessary burdens of spiritual leadership that her husband carried. The record shows a formal vote was taken to reaffirm their fullest and unwavering faith in the Reverend's methods and moral guidance. This official document is a record of institutional complicity in its purest form. The deacons were presented with a credible, if cautiously phrased, warning from the person with the most intimate knowledge of the situation. Their response was not to investigate, nor even to question the Reverend privately, but to close ranks around their leader and pathologize the accuser. They chose to protect the institution's authority and the patriarch's power over the potential truth of the warning. They did not just ignore Sarah's plea, they formally censured her for making it. Sarah's diary entry from the day after the meeting is one of the shortest and most devastating in the entire book. It consists of a single, stark sentence. "They have sided with him. There is no one to turn to. We are alone with his righteousness." This entry marks the death of her hope. The social fracture is now complete. She is not just isolated within her home, but she is now officially isolated from her community and her church. The very institution that should have been her refuge had become an extension of her husband's will, a chorus affirming his righteousness and her own supposed weakness. The deacons' meeting represents a crucial turning point. It demonstrates that the horror of the Pritchard parish was not the secret crime of one deviant man, but a crime enabled by an entire social structure. The system was designed not to expose such truths, but to suppress them. The men in that room were not necessarily evil, but they were deeply invested in a power structure that could not accommodate a woman's testimony against a man, especially not a man of God. Their failure to act was not a passive oversight, but an active choice to preserve order at the cost of justice. This event sealed Anna's fate, and by extension, the fate of the Pritchard children. With no possibility of outside intervention, the dynamic within the household was now a closed loop of escalating abuse and silent suffering. The Reverend, his authority now officially endorsed by his peers, would have felt utterly vindicated, his methods not just permissible, but divinely sanctioned. Any lingering restraint he might have felt would have vanished. The last barrier to his absolute power had been removed. The record of this social fracture is essential to understanding what happened next. It establishes the complete absence of any avenue for legal or social justice. Anna was trapped, not just by her legal status as a slave, but by a religious and social system that was actively complicit in her torture. Sarah was silenced, her credibility formally destroyed. In this vacuum of accountability, where all official channels of recourse have been exhausted and failed, the conditions are ripe for a different, more primal form of justice to emerge. The climax of Sarah Pritchard's diary, and the emotional heart of the entire dark affair, is her entry for the night of March 2nd, 1851. It is not a recollection written after the fact, but a frantic, real-time account of a mother's worst nightmare, scrawled across several pages in a script that deteriorates from controlled penmanship to an almost illegible scrawl. This entry does not offer a hypothesis, it is the irrefutable evidence of the crime itself, a primary source document that captures the precise moment when the long-simmering horror finally boiled over into an act of catastrophic retribution. The entry begins in the dead of night. Sarah writes of being awakened not by a sound, but by its absence. The usual nocturnal noises of a rural house, the creak of floorboards, the sigh of the wind, the distant bark of a dog, were gone. The silence, she writes, was profound and unnatural, a heavy blanket over the world. It was this oppressive quiet that drew her from her bed and sent her on a round of the children's rooms. Her two eldest sons were asleep. But the room shared by her three youngest children, Gideon, Ruth, and Mary, was empty. Their beds were cold, as if they had been gone for hours. What follows is a harrowing account of the initial panicked search. She and the Reverend, roused from his sleep, moved through the house and then out into the frigid yard, calling the children's names into the darkness. There was no response. The property was still, the world locked in that same unnatural silence. Sarah describes a growing sense of dread so powerful it was physically nauseating, a certainty that something had gone terribly wrong. The search grew more frantic. Other members of the household were woken, lanterns were lit, but the children had vanished as if they had never been. The most chilling section of the entry is a postscript, which Sarah indicates was written just before dawn, after the initial search had failed and a sense of grim reality had set in. She had returned to her bedroom window, the same one from which she had watched the rituals in the cabin, and was staring out at the grey, pre-dawn light. It was then that she saw a figure emerge from the direction of the dog kennels, moving with a calm, unhurried gait. It was Anna, who was supposed to be locked in her cabin. She was humming a quiet, tuneless melody. Sarah describes her own reaction with stark honesty. She did not call out, did not raise the alarm. She simply watched, paralyzed by a sudden, intuitive understanding of what had happened. She writes that Anna walked across the yard, her bare feet seemingly impervious to the frozen ground, and stopped directly below Sarah's window. She looked up, and their eyes met. There was no fear in Anna's face, no guilt, no defiance. There was only the same profound, unnerving stillness that Sarah had noted before, now amplified into something that felt ancient and absolute. It is here that the diary records the words that serve as the only direct confession to the crime. Anna smiled, a small, sad, and utterly final expression. She spoke in a voice that was not loud, but which carried with perfect clarity in the still air. She said, "They are with the Lord now, ma'am. They finally understand what they did." The words were delivered not as a threat or a boast, but as a simple statement of fact, a pronouncement of a sentence that had already been carried out. It was a declaration of a justice that had been served. The documented impact of this moment on Sarah is one of complete psychological collapse. She does not record screaming or fainting or even confronting Anna. She simply reports the words, and then the diary entry ends abruptly. The following pages are blank. It is as if the horror of that statement and the smile that accompanied it was so profound that it shattered her ability to process reality, let alone record it. This is the irrefutable evidence, a direct, cryptic confession from the perpetrator, witnessed and documented by the victim's own mother. Anna's statement is a masterpiece of horrific ambiguity. On the surface, it is a statement of religious comfort. The children are with the Lord, but in the context of the Reverend's theology of pain, it is a chilling inversion. The children, who had been learning to administer lessons of cruelty, have now finally understood what it was they were participating in from the other side. Anna has taken the Reverend's own twisted logic and used it to explain her act of retribution. She has not just killed his children, she has judged them according to their father's own corrupted scripture. This entry transforms the story. It is no longer about the mystery of what happened to the children, but about the terrifying certainty of it. The suspense shifts from the physical act to the moral and spiritual implications. How could a woman, herself a victim of unimaginable cruelty, commit such an intimate and monstrous act against innocent children? Anna's words suggest an answer. In the world the Reverend had created, there were no innocent children, only students of cruelty who had just received their final terrible lesson. The blank pages that follow in the diary are as eloquent as any written word. They represent the silence of utter devastation, the point at which trauma becomes unspeakable. The irrefutable evidence has been presented, and its impact is the complete shattering of the chronicler's world. The story of the Pritchard family, as a coherent narrative that Sarah can tell herself, is over. All that is left is to document the fallout from this single, cataclysmic event. In the aftermath of the children's disappearance and Anna's cryptic confession, Sarah Pritchard's diary, after several blank pages, resumes with a series of sparse, disconnected entries that document the complete moral and psychological disintegration of her husband. The Reverend Samuel Pritchard, the man of unshakable faith and absolute authority, the architect of a theology of righteous pain, was utterly broken by a consequence he had never foreseen. His collapse was not a descent into grief, but a panicked, frantic retreat from a truth he could not face, a truth that implicated him as the ultimate author of his own family's destruction. Sarah's entries describe the public performance of the grieving father. The Reverend led the community searches, his powerful voice booming with prayers for the safe return of his beloved lambs. He accepted the solemn condolences of his congregation, his face a mask of tragic piety. He delivered a sermon the following Sunday on the inscrutable will of God, a masterpiece of public sorrow that moved many in the pews to tears. He played the part of the afflicted patriarch perfectly, using the tools of his trade to control the public narrative and frame the event as a mysterious external tragedy. Behind the closed doors of the Pritchard home, however, a very different story was unfolding. Sarah documents a man undone. She writes of him locking himself in his study for days on end, refusing food and speaking to no one. When he did emerge, he was a spectre of his former self, his eyes darting around as if expecting an accuser to leap from the shadows. She recounts him pacing the length of the house at night, muttering fragments of scripture, his voice no longer booming with authority, but thin and reedy with fear. The public pillar of the community had become a private, haunted man. The most telling detail in Sarah's account of his collapse is his absolute refusal to speak Anna's name, or even to acknowledge her existence in the days following the disappearance. When the county sheriff came to the house to take statements, the Reverend provided a detailed account of the night, but omitted any mention of Anna's presence, her disappearance from the cabin, or her chilling words to his wife. He actively erased her from the official record of the event, a desperate act of self-preservation that revealed his deep, unspoken understanding of her role in the tragedy. The definitive act of his collapse, the moment that confirmed his guilt and his fear, came a week after the children vanished. Sarah's diary records the event with a numb precision. The Reverend summoned his two remaining sons, Josiah and Abel, not to the study for a lesson, but to the yard with their hunting rifles. His command, which Sarah overheard from the porch, was delivered in a choked, desperate whisper that carried none of his usual authority. He ordered them to take the dogs, all 7 of them, deep into the swamp and shoot them. This act was not one of rage or grief. The dogs were valuable property, highly trained and essential for security. Their execution was a calculated, panicked destruction of evidence. The dogs were the murder weapons, the only living witnesses to what had happened at the kennels that night. By ordering his sons to kill them, the Reverend was not just eliminating a threat, he was once again forcing his children to become complicit in his secrets, making them the executioners of the proof of a crime he could not bring himself to acknowledge. It was a final, desperate attempt to bury the truth under a layer of silence and bullets. The impact of this order on the boys is not detailed by Sarah, but the act itself speaks volumes. They were being asked to destroy the very animals that had been symbols of their father's power, the enforcers of his will. The act was a tacit admission that this power had gone monstrously wrong, that the instruments of control had become instruments of a judgment he could not escape. The authority of the patriarch was not just collapsing, it was actively consuming its own foundations in a desperate attempt to survive. Sarah's description of the aftermath is haunting. The house, once filled with the sounds of a large family and the commanding voice of its leader, fell into a profound and lasting silence. The Reverend retreated permanently into his study, a ghost in his own home. The public searches were eventually called off. The community accepted the official story of a tragic, unsolved disappearance, but within the walls of the Pritchard house, the truth was a palpable presence, a silent, suffocating knowledge that had broken the man who believed his authority was absolute. The collapse of the Reverend Pritchard is the logical endpoint of his own ideology. He had built his world on the principle of righteous control, the idea that pain, properly applied, could bend any will to his own. He never imagined that the subject of his experiment might learn the lesson too well and apply it back to him with such devastating precision. Anna had not just taken his children, she had taken his certainty, his righteousness, and his voice. All that was left was a hollow man, a king presiding over an empire of ashes, forever haunted by the silence where his authority used to be. For decades, The official story of the Pritchard children's disappearance settled into the collective memory of Claiborne County as a sad but ultimately straightforward tragedy. They had wandered off into the woods on a cold night and succumbed to the elements, their bodies never found. The Reverend's subsequent decline and his wife's departure were seen as the understandable consequences of unbearable grief. The truth, as recorded in Sarah Pritchard's hidden diary, lay dormant, a secret waiting for a catalyst. That catalyst would not arrive until 1972, with the discovery of a hidden source that revealed the community's silent, fearful complicity in the cover-up. During the cataloging of historical documents for the Mississippi State Archives, a researcher came across a bundle of personal letters from the estate of a prominent Vicksburg family. The letters were written by a former Claiborne County Sheriff, Thomas Wade, to his brother, a lawyer in Vicksburg. Tucked among mundane accounts of crop prices and local politics was a letter dated April 1851, just 6 weeks after the Pritchard children vanished. This document, written in the confidential tone of one brother to another, provided the first external perspective on the events and exposed the official investigation as a deliberate sham. Sheriff Wade began the letter by stating the official conclusion. The search had been formally ended and the case was being classified as an unsolved tragedy. But he immediately followed this with a blunt, private admission. "Between us, the whole affair is a charade, a piece of theatre for the benefit of those who lack the stomach for the truth." He wrote that from the very beginning, the investigation was hampered by a profound and unnatural reluctance on the part of everyone involved to speak freely. Key witnesses, including the remaining Pritchard household staff, offered vague, contradictory statements, their eyes filled with a fear that went far beyond grief. The letter explicitly mentions Anna, confirming that she had indeed disappeared from the county roughly 2 weeks after the children. The sheriff notes the official explanation was that she had run off, taking advantage of the chaos, but he dismisses this, writing, "A girl like that does not simply vanish into thin air in this part of the country. Someone aided her. Someone wanted her gone." He describes his attempt to question Reverend Pritchard about Anna's disappearance, an encounter that he calls the most unsettling of his career. The Reverend, he writes, refused to even acknowledge the question, staring at him with the eyes of a man already in his own grave. The most damning part of the letter is the sheriff's assessment of the congregation and the community at large. He articulates a hypothesis that is chilling in its implications. He writes, "They know, perhaps not all the details, but they know the truth, or a piece of it, is not in the woods, but in that house, on that land. But they are more afraid of what that truth means for the foundation of their world than they are of any killer lurking in the night. They are protecting not the Reverend, but the idea of the Reverend. They are protecting their own faith from a truth it cannot possibly withstand. This hidden source fundamentally alters the understanding of the case. The crime was not just committed by one woman and covered up by one man. It was enabled and then deliberately buried by an entire community, bound together by a collective unspoken agreement to choose a comforting lie over a devastating truth. The wall of silence that the sheriff encountered was not built of ignorance, but of a calculated self-preservational fear. To admit that the man they had elevated as their moral compass was a monster, and that his monstrousness had birthed an even greater horror, was to admit that their entire world was built on a foundation of lies. The sheriff's letter also provides a plausible explanation for Anna's successful escape. If the community, in its silent complicity, simply wanted the entire affair to disappear, then turning a blind eye to Anna's flight would have been the most expedient solution. Her presence was a constant living reminder of the questions they did not want to ask. Her absence allowed the comforting narrative of a tragic accident to take root. She was allowed to vanish because her vanishing was essential to the community's psychological survival. This document, a private confession from the very man in charge of the official investigation, fills in the crucial gap between the private horror of Sarah's diary and the public silence that followed. It reveals that the social fracture was not just a matter of the deacons siding with their pastor. It was a county-wide conspiracy of silence, a collective decision to sacrifice justice for the sake of stability. The monster, as the sheriff so aptly puts it, was not just one person, but the community that had created the conditions for him to thrive, and which now had to live with the consequences. The letter ends on a note of weary resignation. The sheriff tells his brother that he is marking the case as closed, not because it is solved, but because it is unsolvable by any legal means. "You cannot prosecute a ghost," he writes, "and you cannot force a town to confront a truth it has already agreed to forget." With this document, the full scope of the tragedy is revealed. It was a crime that implicated not just a victim and a perpetrator, but an entire society. A society that chose to bury its sins deep in the Mississippi soil, hoping they would never be unearthed. The final coherent entry in Sarah Pritchard's diary serves as her personal and maternal last will and testament. It is not a confession nor an accusation, but a quiet, resolute justification for the decisive action she is about to take. The abandonment of her husband, her home, and the life she has known, in a desperate act of preservation. The entry is dated late April 1851, several weeks after the town has fallen into its conspiracy of silence, and a month after Anna has vanished from the record. It is the statement of a woman who has accepted that there is no justice to be found, only survival. The entry begins with a description of the suffocating atmosphere within the Pritchard house. The silence, she writes, is no longer just an absence of sound, but a living entity, a heavy, oppressive presence that fills every room. Her husband remains a recluse in his study, a non-entity, while her two surviving sons, Josiah and Abel, move through their days like ghosts, their trauma locked away behind a wall of stoic silence. The house is no longer a home, but a tomb, a monument to the children who are gone and the faith that has died. Her decision to leave is presented not as an act of anger or rebellion, but as a grim, maternal necessity. The core of her justification is a devastatingly simple and powerful idea. The land itself is poisoned. She writes, "I cannot save the ones who are gone. I can only try to save the ones who remain from the poison in this soil, a poison that my husband cultivated in the name of God." She believes that to stay would be to condemn her remaining sons to be consumed by the same darkness that took their siblings, to be forever haunted and defined by the secrets buried on their own property. The diary details her plan with a methodical, almost cold precision. She has been secretly selling her personal jewelry and family heirlooms to a sympathetic cousin in a neighboring town, accumulating enough cash for passage and a new start. She will tell her sons they are going to visit her sister in Natchez for an extended stay. She knows her husband, lost in his own private hell, will not stop her. Her action is not an escape in the heat of the moment, but a carefully planned exodus, a strategic retreat from a battlefield where the war has already been lost. Her justification is focused entirely on the future of Josiah and Abel. She sees in them the deep scars of their father's lessons, the forced complicity in Anna's torture, and the subsequent command to execute the dogs. She believes their only chance at a life free from that shadow is to be physically removed from the place where those sins were committed. Perhaps in a new place, she writes, they can forget the feel of a key to a locked cabin and the weight of a rifle in their hands. Perhaps they can become men, not the kind their father envisioned, but good men. Her flight is an act of maternal redemption. A crucial part of her plan involves the diary itself. She writes that she cannot bring herself to destroy it, feeling that a record of the truth must exist somewhere in the world, even if it is never read. But she cannot take it with her, as its discovery would endanger her and her sons, tying them forever to the scandal she is trying to escape. Her solution is to hide it in the one place her husband would never look, a place of public piety that he has, in her eyes, desecrated, the church pulpit. She will seal it in oilcloth and conceal it, an act of faith that one day the truth will be brought to light. This decision to hide the diary rather than destroy it is a quiet act of defiance. It is a refusal to be completely erased by the community's silence. By preserving her testimony, she is placing a time bomb at the heart of the official narrative, a secret that will tick away for decades until it is finally discovered. It is her only way of ensuring that Anna's story, her children's story, and her own story will not be entirely lost to the self-serving amnesia of Claiborne County. The final lines of the entry are a prayer, but not one that asks for justice or understanding. It is a prayer for oblivion. She writes, "I will hide this book and pray that God forgives us all, for we do not deserve it. May He grant my sons the mercy of forgetting, and may He grant me the strength to never speak of this again." Her decisive action is, therefore, twofold: a physical escape to save her children's future, and the burial of her testimony to preserve the truth for a time when it might finally be heard. With this entry, Sarah Pritchard takes control of her own narrative for the last time. She has been a passive witness, a failed petitioner, and a grieving mother. Now, she becomes an archivist of a great and terrible secret, the sole agent ensuring that the story does not end with the official report of a tragic accident. Her flight is not an act of cowardice, but a profound, if quiet, act of courage, the decision to save what little is left from the ruins and to entrust the final telling of the tale to the hands of a future she will never see. Suddenly, after journeying through the terrified whispers of Sarah Pritchard's diary, the detached observations of a country doctor, and the weary resignation of a compromised sheriff, the narrative returns to its starting point, the forensic report of 1904. This document, once a cold and shocking introduction to the mystery, is now the final, irrefutable primary source. Read again, with the full weight of the preceding testimony, its clinical, scientific language becomes something else entirely, a stark, brutal, and horrifyingly poetic confirmation of everything the other sources have suggested. It is the story's unblinking, objective climax. The report's first key finding, the identification of the remains as belonging to 3 juveniles with ages consistent with the missing Pritchard children, is now no longer a mystery, but a confirmation of the crime's victims. The science gives a name and a reality to the ghosts that have haunted the narrative. These are not just missing children from a local legend. They are Gideon, Ruth, and Mary Pritchard, their small skeletons a testament to the catastrophic failure of the world that was supposed to protect them. The report transforms them from a historical anomaly into physical fact. The second key finding, regarding the cause of death, is where the horror becomes visceral. The report details the forensic analysis of the bones. The remains exhibit extensive post-mortem and peri-mortem trauma, including punctures, fractures, and scoring consistent with multiple canine bites. The sheer number and depth of the marks suggest a frenzied attack by several animals. This scientific language provides an unsparing image of the children's final moments, a scene of primal violence that Sarah's diary could only hint at. It confirms that they were, quite literally, devoured. But it is the third and most crucial finding that elevates the crime from a simple act of brutality to one of terrifying, calculated intimacy. The forensic examiner notes, there is a conspicuous absence of defensive wounds on the skeletons. No evidence of struggle, such as parry fractures on the forearms or hesitation marks, was found. This suggests the children were either unconscious or, more likely, did not perceive the animals as a threat prior to the attack. This single, sterile observation is the most damning piece of evidence in the entire case. This absence of a struggle is the scientific proof of Anna's methodology. It confirms she did not drive the children towards the dogs, nor did she simply unleash the animals on them. She must have lured them, leading them by the hand to the kennels, perhaps with the promise of a game or a secret. They would have trusted her. She was a familiar presence, a caregiver. They would have felt no fear as she brought them to the place of their death. The horror lies not in the violence of the attack, but in the profound betrayal that preceded it. The report's final conclusion regarding the burial provides the last piece of the puzzle. It states, the methodical arrangement and depth of the burial beneath the kennel foundation indicate a deliberate and strenuous effort to conceal the bodies, suggesting the perpetrator had intimate knowledge of the property and a clear motive to ensure the remains would not be discovered. This confirms that the act was not one of impulsive rage, but a planned, carefully executed operation. Anna did not just kill the children. She erased them, burying them under the very symbols of their father's violent authority. Interpreted through the lens of Sarah's diary, the forensic report becomes Anna's final, silent testimony. It tells the story she was never able to tell. The bite marks are the physical record of the Reverend's lessons being turned back on his own family. The lack of defensive wounds is the proof of the children's indoctrination. They had learned to see the instruments of their father's cruelty as a normal part of their world, and so felt no fear of them. The hidden grave is Anna's final act of control, a secret she kept for all time. The clinical detachment of the scientific language, when laid alongside the emotional turmoil of Sarah's diary, creates a powerful narrative dissonance. Sarah tells us what it felt like to live through the horror. The report tells us what the horror actually was, in cold, measurable terms. It is the story's ultimate, unbiased narrator, a voice from the future that speaks only of bones and evidence, but in doing so confirms the deepest fears and the most terrible truths of the past. The reading of this document serves as the story's climax because there is nothing left to say after it. All the questions of what happened have been answered with empirical certainty. The only questions that remain are those of morality and meaning, questions that no scientific report can answer. The bones have spoken, and their testimony is absolute. The final primary source has delivered its verdict, leaving the audience to grapple with the terrifying human story that it so clinically confirms. Following Sarah Pritchard's flight from Claiborne County and the community's tacit agreement to bury the truth, the documented consequences of the tragedy unfolded slowly. A quiet unraveling recorded in the spare, impersonal language of public records. The Pritchard name, once a cornerstone of the county's social and religious life, began a steady fade into obscurity. The legacy of the events of March 1851 was not one of public scandal or legal reckoning, but of silence, decay, and the slow transformation of history into a haunting local myth. United States Census records provide a stark, skeletal outline of the family's dissolution. The 1860 census for Claiborne County lists Samuel Pritchard, age 55, living alone on his property. His occupation is no longer listed as Reverend, but as farmer. His wife, Sarah, is noted as deceased, a deliberate falsehood that legally and socially severed his connection to the family that had abandoned him. This small, bureaucratic lie speaks volumes. He had become a widower not by the hand of God, but by his own actions, and had chosen to formalize his isolation in the public record. The records for the Methodist Church he once led tell a similar story of decline. Congregational logs show a steep drop in attendance in the years following 1851. Families began to drift away to other parishes, and by the end of the decade, the church was struggling to maintain a congregation. A traveling minister who visited the county in 1868 described the Pritchard parish as a place of profound spiritual malaise, its building falling into disrepair. The church was officially deconsecrated and abandoned in 1870. The moral authority that had once been its foundation had crumbled, and the institution itself simply withered away. Of Sarah Pritchard and her sons, Josiah and Abel, the historical record is more sparse. They appear in the 1860 census in Natchez, living with Sarah's sister, their surname changed to her maiden name, a clear attempt to break from the past. After that, they disappear from Mississippi records, likely moving further west, subsumed into the great tide of American expansion. There is no evidence they ever spoke of what happened in Claiborne County. Their survival depended on their silence, and they seem to have kept their pact with the past. And what of Anna? Her name, as Sheriff Wade's letter predicted, never appears in any official document again. She does not appear in fugitive slave postings, nor in census records from free states or Canada. She vanishes from recorded history as completely as the children she took. Her disappearance is so total that it feels less like an escape and more like a transfiguration. She ceased to be a person and became instead an idea, a cautionary tale whispered in the slave quarters of the county. The most powerful evidence of her legacy is not found in an archive, but in the realm of folklore. In 1938, as part of the Works Progress Administration's project to record the life stories of former slaves, an interviewer sat down with an elderly man in rural Mississippi named Elijah Haskins. His grandfather had been enslaved on a plantation that bordered the Pritchard property. Elijah recounted many stories from his childhood, but one in particular stands out. A tale, he said, was used to frighten children into obedience. He told the story of the shadow woman from the Pritchard place, a spirit who was once a slave, tortured by a cruel preacher. The legend says that the preacher taught his children his own wickedness, and so the shadow woman, to cleanse the land, called the children to the kennels and had the hounds devour their sins. The story ends with the warning that the shadow woman still walks the woods on moonless nights, listening for the sins of children, ready to offer them up to the hounds of justice. This piece of folklore is the final and perhaps most enduring consequence of Anna's act. In the absence of any official justice, the community of the enslaved created their own. They transformed Anna from a historical person into a mythic figure, an avenging spirit who enacted a form of divine or natural justice that the white world's laws could never provide. She became a symbol of ultimate resistance, a cautionary tale that was not about the danger of disobedience, but about the terrifying, inevitable consequences of absolute cruelty. Thus, the legacy of the Pritchard case is twofold. In the official white historical record, it is a story of decay and disappearance, a family and a church that simply faded away, the reasons for their decline politely forgotten. But in the unwritten oral tradition of the African American community, it became a powerful myth of retribution. A story of how a woman who was treated as less than human became something more than human. A legend, a spirit, a permanent and haunting presence in the landscape of a crime that could not be fully erased. Indeed, it is the story of Anna and the Pritchard children exists today only as a collection of fragments, a mother's terrified diary, a doctor's suspicious ledger, a lawman's weary letter, and the cold, hard evidence of bones in the earth. Assembled, these pieces create a narrative of such profound horror and moral complexity that it resists easy judgment. It is a case that forces us to confront the nature of justice in a system where none exists, and to ask what happens when a human being is pushed beyond the limits of endurance into a realm where the only available response is an act of commensurate horror. The site of the former Pritchard Parish is now nothing more than an overgrown clearing in the Mississippi woods, indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape except for a few crumbling foundation stones. Local legend, however, maintains a distinction. It is said that the land is soured, that deer will not graze there, and that no dog, no matter how well trained, can be made to walk on the ground where the kennels once stood. Whether this is a product of supernatural influence or simply the power of a story passed down through generations, the effect is the same. The land is marked, a permanent physical testament to the events that transpired there. Anna's act can be viewed through several lenses. To the law, it was a brutal murder of 3 innocent children, an act of unconscionable cruelty. The children, by any civilized standard, were not responsible for the sins of their father. They were victims twice over, first of their father's monstrous indoctrination, and then of Anna's terrible retribution. In this interpretation, Anna is a tragic figure who, broken by her suffering, became the very monster she was fighting against, perpetuating a cycle of violence by visiting it upon the most vulnerable. Yet, another interpretation, the one preserved in the folklore of the Shadow Woman, sees the act not as murder, but as a form of ritualistic cleansing. In the perverse moral universe created by Reverend Pritchard, the children had ceased to be entirely innocent. They were being forged into his successors, their hands and minds being stained by their forced participation in Anna's torture. From this perspective, Anna's act was not one of revenge against the children, but a radical, surgical strike against the future of the evil itself. She was destroying not just the pastor's lineage, but his legacy. This interpretation does not absolve the act of its horror, but it places it within the terrifying logic of the world the Reverend himself had built. He had taught through his actions that pain was a tool of purification and that certain people could be used as instruments for the salvation of others. Anna simply took his theology to its ultimate conclusion. She used the pain of his children to purify the land of his influence, and she used herself as the instrument of a judgment he had inadvertently designed. It was a dark, blasphemous, and perfectly symmetrical baptism. The central open question of the Pritchard case, therefore, is not about what happened, but about how we are to understand it. Was Anna's act a monstrous crime born of madness and despair, or was it something else, a calculated act of war, an expression of a form of justice that operates outside of and in opposition to human law, a terrifying but necessary excision of a cancer before it could spread to another generation? Can an act be both a moral atrocity and a form of righteous deliverance at the same time? The silence from Anna herself is absolute, leaving us only to interpret the shadows she left behind. Her story is a stark reminder that the institution of slavery was not just a system of labor, but a creator of intimate psychological hells, where the oppressed were sometimes forced to choose between annihilation and the commission of horrors of their own. She was a product of a world that had denied her humanity, and her final act was a terrifying assertion of her will, an act that made her impossible to ignore, and equally impossible to fully comprehend. We are left, in the end, with the image of a woman humming a quiet tune as she walks away from an act of unimaginable violence, her face calm, her purpose fulfilled. We do not know where she went or what life she lived after she vanished from Mississippi. She disappears into the great unwritten history of those who resisted. Her story serves as a chilling indictment of a society that could create such a person and such a choice, a legacy that continues to haunt the American landscape in ways we are still struggling to understand. The final truth of the Pritchard Parish is that some crimes contaminate not only the people involved, but the very ground on which they are committed. And some forms of justice, born from unbearable suffering, are so absolute and so terrible that they can never be fully reconciled with our own understanding of morality. They can only be recorded, contemplated, and remembered as a warning that the past is never truly past, and that its ghosts, in one form or another, are always with us. The stories that shape our world are rarely the ones found in official textbooks. They are hidden in the margins, in forgotten diaries, and in the silent testimony of the earth itself. These are the narratives that hold the most profound truths about who we are. If you believe that understanding the past requires us to confront its most challenging and uncomfortable corners, then you have found your community. Subscribe to But Before the Story and join us in the archives. We are not just telling stories, we are piecing together the hidden architecture of history, one buried truth at a time. The most important stories are always waiting for those who are brave enough to look. We'll see you in the next investigation.